Three, two, one, and we should be recording. Uh, all right, I'm Max. I'm a contributor at The Void, and this is one of the first interview pieces we're doing. This new series we're trying to do, where we're just interviewing authors. Today, I'm here with Kelvin, also known as KJ. He wrote the interview for the October edition of The Void, and yeah. So how's it going, Kelvin?
Great, Max. Yeah, good to be here. Good to be talking. This is actually my first interview to do with anything that I've written, so pretty cool and nerve-wracking at the same time. Yeah,
Yeah, I get that. Totally casual.
yeah,
And then I guess to start, just if you had to write the inside cover, the inside flap of your book, what would it say? Who are you? Like that basic thing.
sure. Yeah, the story of the interview is something that I wrote actually a couple of years ago. The entire premise is getting to a point in the future where people aren't so much living day to day in a more biological sense. It's more of a structured thing. So if you want to have children, you basically have to go to an interview and test to have your means scored and a couple other things about you, and then you will be given a license. Um, the idea behind it, I suppose, was to kind of like push at the concept of automation. So the way that the entire world is going, we're seeing more and more things become automated, and in this sense, we see the entire human experience automated to a certain function. It was a really interesting story to write. I know that you guys at the Voids helped me edit it quite a bit, and it was really interesting to see that experience as well. But yeah, other than that, this comes from like my own experience. I've lived in a couple countries now. I've lived in Canada, Australia, now Ireland. And what I'm seeing a lot of is I tend to go to a lot of interviews for recruitment agencies. It's like my go-to thing when I get into a country. I go straight to an interview with a recruitment agency, and it's funny how after a while those things just kind of get blurred together as just this weird experience of like tell me who you are in a productive sense. You don't give a shit about like who you are as a person anymore. You're basically down to a one-page description of yourself. And I wondered how far that would go in the future, how much that would sort of take over our daily lives. And that's essentially what the interview is about.
Yeah, going off that, it was one of the most in this edition, in my opinion, one of the most like just like deeply poignant pieces in the piece. It was so like it was so relatable, especially I don't know, like if anyone's watching, I don't know if you're watching, but in the U.S. election and in the Democratic primary, there was a primary challenger, Andrew Yang, whose like whole thing is this like fear of automation and what are we gonna do, and like just like the coming like basically apocalypse of having so many people left out of the workforce and left out of having anything meaningful to do with their lives, basically. And
Exactly.
that
Yeah.
was I think my favorite part about your piece was this focus on the guy sitting in the interview is so focused on his hands, right? And he's like, they like used to be so valuable. Like I could build something, I could create, and like I think all people can relate to that. Like the ability to externalize yourself into a piece of work, and how we're like losing that, and that's becoming automated away, and there's no need to do that. And I think that was just so like you hit on something so just like timeless, but also extremely like important for like the discussion right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a real big fear nowadays. Because I mean, like I've read tons of articles, and one of the main things is the transportation industry in America, especially. That could be completely obliterated in the next 10 years because once they start automating trucks, then there's no need for, I think it's like 400,000 people are in that industry. You could basically wipe out that entire industry. And like growing up for me, like I was born in 1988, so we had like a bit of we were kind of in just the beginning of like the tech era, seeing like computers take over functions that were previously done by people on pieces of paper. And it was so exciting to see that like leap in automation because it made things so much easier, and like the capabilities of like your standard one person was pushed to its limits. But now it's getting to the age of becoming scary because now it's not so much this automation is like here to help me be better at my job. It's like this automation will replace me in the future, which I always thought was fucking terrifying. Especially my previous industry was project management and construction, and I watched a couple of years ago like a documentary about this company that basically built this AI that did my entire job for me from start to finish, and like did it better than me. And the entire like advertisement of this program was like, you can eliminate your employment costs by 25%. And I was like, that's great for people that are, you know, up here, but for the middle class, it's pretty terrifying. And I'm sure that, sorry, I didn't hear that. What was that guy? Alan?
Oh, Andrew Yang. He was a presidential candidate. Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't hear, sorry, I didn't see that because we're in Ireland. We're more focused on the Irish politics at the moment, but
of course.
But yeah, I have been following the American thing. I didn't see that one, but that would be really interesting to watch because I'd like to see somebody's perspective on where they think automation is going.
Yeah, it was really interesting. So his premise was he ran on this policy. His like whole campaign was built around this idea of universal basic income and the need for that basically to account for this, like the mass amount of people that like will be by virtue of automation pushed out of the workforce. But the one problem I had with that pitch, like I think it's a great start, and he's the only one trying to grapple with this like this coming problem. But I think the point that your piece pointed out was like that's not quite all of what is pulled away from you when like you don't have a job or a purpose, right? It's not just that you don't have the means to live, it's that you don't have the like, again, I keep going back to this focus on the hands, right? There's this like, there's no purpose, right? There's no, why do I get up in the morning if the check just shows up in the door and like all my needs are taken care of for me, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really true. I did really enjoy the hands thing. And I think it was you guys that actually like focused on like, this is a really, really good point. And I was like, that was kind of like an afterthought. And I was like, it is a good point because that was the premise of the character. He's an electrician, which in our day and age, especially 10, 20 years ago, was like the peak of like, you know, the trade skills. That was like the thing that got you the most money. You required like so many degrees and it was such a valuable skill to have. But for him to be looking down at his hands and be like, so sad that they used to be worth something and that his degree as an electrician used to be worth something. And then it's just so casually dismissed in the interview as just, it's not applicable anymore. It's just one of the things that we don't need anymore, which is, you know, it's the same as people that used to be typists full time and people that used to, I'm sure there's 100 different occupations that have disappeared over the years because of automation. And it's really interesting that guy is like trying to tackle that issue with universal income, because that's another thing that that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, I can't imagine it being very popular in America right now. The idea of universal income, giving away money for free, is a pretty hard thing to get people's minds around, for sure.
Yeah, he was met with basically dismissal, and I think it is it's similar of being kind of we see it all the time, right? Of someone who's like a little too early on an issue, right?
Yeah.
All your problems with Al Gore or whatever, but that's kind of what I remind. I don't know how closely you follow American politics, but Al Gore in the early 2000s, right? Is just a little too early on climate change, and he kind of builds his whole campaign around it, and like most people dismiss it as like, well, that's down the road, and now it's a mainstay of all political conversations now. So I think that's kind of where Yang is he was just like one generation or one election cycle or a couple election cycles too early on this question of automation. The worry with that though is most of the time it's okay that it takes us a second to catch up, but I don't know if like with the speed of technology and how fast things are moving in the tech sector, it's like if we don't get a handle on this or like are starting to discuss this issue now, it might be too late, right? Like if
absolutely, yeah, very good point. You're totally right, because things like when we were growing up, we think that things progress at like a static pace, but they don't. It's an exponential thing, and things like this technology is expanding at a point never seen before. And you're totally right. I know there's a lot of Scandinavian countries that are exploring the universal income options, which makes a lot of sense for them. I mean, they're much smaller countries with less people. America has like a whole different range of like problems, and quite often, like I was talking to my girlfriend about this. And we don't like compare. We used to compare America to like Germany and like just look at the differences, but it's more like comparing America to the European Union,
Of course,
because you guys
that's
are,
yeah, that's
yeah,
what I think.
yeah, because they're more similar in the population and then the variation across countries and states. So it's crazy to think that one candidate, especially like you said, way too early, before people really think of automation as a threat. People still think of automation as like the best thing that's ever happened, and it is. It really, really is if you have some kind of plan in place. And I guess that's what the interview is trying to point out. Their plan in the interview was to reduce the population slowly by offering people an alternative to your body, which I try to think of the most horrific consequence of like ignoring this issue is to getting to a point where the government is basically like, we don't want you here. You're kind of useless. It sucks that you keep having kids because that fucks up for us. Could you perhaps kill yourself? That's like the logical point that this sort of thing is going to if we don't address it.
So pressing, so yeah, that is that ending point and this idea of uploading yourself. It is a question that we got a lot, and it is something I have to ask you about. Is so it's left ambiguous in the piece, as if like, okay, are they tricking him, right? Like, is it actually like, is there actually a simulation like the Matrix style, like everything is kind of taken care of for you? It's like, but like you get out of the way, right? So like we don't have to deal with it. Like you're just
Yeah,
numbers on a computer. Or is it just like, is it more sinister, right? Is it have they concocted this lie of a simulation, just to kind of like get you to like willingly commit suicide, and like there's nothing, like it's just the void, no pun intended.
that is
And
a
I guess,
brilliant.
yeah, my
Yeah,
question is, was that on purpose? Is that ambiguous? Is there an answer? Or I guess that, yeah, that's my question.
I mean, the best thing about these small stories is you have to keep things ambiguous because you don't have enough um, time to write everything out. But absolutely, it was kept ambiguous on purpose. And I actually had a friend who pointed out that he was like, "Are they fucking with him? Like, does he actually have like an afterlife?" And I was like, "You know what? Actually, I don't know." And it's very hard to juggle all the complexities of that kind of issue. But if that were to happen in a real life scenario, I would think like 50% of the population would assume that this was bullshit, and there'd be like riots in the street. But no, it's one of those like, I don't want to ruin the story, but it's it's either way
Yeah,
it's horrific.
of course, of course.
Um, and then also it comes into account, like you start thinking about like what is the actual afterlife, like by putting yourself, if they do actually offer this eternal life in like a simulator in a server somewhere, are you then denying yourself from the potential to actually go to heaven, like if there is a heaven? It's so horrific on so many levels. But it's really interesting that people thought about that, because that really shows like the nihilistic sort of like anti-trusting pessimism behind everybody, I guess. Makes
Yeah, I
sense,
think
I suppose.
that's yeah, I think that's something that's super prominent right now, especially like the deep mistrust of like
Mistrust
basically
everything.
anyone with power, right? Like
Yeah,
it's just, yeah.
pretty much.
So
Yeah,
yeah, I think that was a almost universal reaction, was like, I think they're probably just fucking with them, right? Like he's like, there's probably nothing over there, and they're just getting him to just like willingly take himself out of the equation.
yep,
But
absolutely.
but like your point is, it stands, right? It's like it almost doesn't matter. The real horror of the story isn't in like whether or not they're lying or not. It's in the fact that like, even if there's an existence of this like matrix like perfect simulation, like there's this deep like, just like, it's just horrible to think that like you would be forced to like give yourself into that, right? It almost takes
Exactly.
away what makes you a human being.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the option there, because it seems so logical from like a policy standpoint. The idea that you just have to reduce population because there's not enough work for everybody. But to actually live that out as a human, to get down to the choice of like, you hope that these guys aren't fucking with you and that there's something there. But even if there is something there, the idea that you have to choose to give your body away because you're useless is just fucking horrific. And it actually comes out. I'm forgetting the reference, but this actually, a lot of this came from a book that I read long ago. I don't even know if it was a book. It was just a thing. It was some guy in like the 1916. There was a famine in Ireland or something, or it was England. Um, I have the worst memory, but anyway, the idea was that the government was looking for ways to basically address this famine because there wasn't enough food. People were starving to death, and the policies were becoming ever more logical and slipping away from the slider bar of like being humane. So it's quite simplistic to think of it this way, but sometimes with policy there is like this bar, and it's like one side is humanity and one side is like logical thinking, and like if you slip too far towards logical thinking, it becomes horrific. And his idea was, this book was based on this thing that this guy was basically talking to these politicians and addressing their use of policy. And he was making all the great points, that this has to happen and we have to reduce the population, etc. And the eventual idea that he came up with to them was, after leading through these logical thought processes, he got down to the point which was, the idea is that why not feed the poor people's kids to them? That completely solves every problem that you're having on a logical point. And they were just, the politicians were obviously just like disgusted by the idea, because all of a sudden it became a humanitarian sort of issue. And I guess this is another thing that kind of went into the interview, was this idea that if you push logical stuff too far, especially in terms of policy, then you will get to a point where, you lose humanity, I suppose.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I think my construction of that problem would be it's slightly different. It's almost, I almost see that the like logic is merely a tool, right, for achieving certain outcomes, right? Like, but what the outcome is at some level irrelevant of the logic itself, right? It's what do we choose to maximize, or what is our goal, right? If our goal is this, like, kind of what you were saying in Ireland, sounded like this like pure utilitarian, almost like the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number, the means matter not, right? Like, what are the logical steps to get there? And to shift back to the automation, right? It's like, if the goal is progress, however defined, right, which is like the most amount, seems to be in modern day, right? Progress is the most amount of stuff generated by the least amount of work, right? So like automation is clearly the like key to getting there, but like, is there somewhere we want to be, right? Like, logic doesn't seem to play into where do we set the like goalpost, right? What are we aiming at? What are we trying to get to? And I think that's the question that people miss, right? And it gives people this kind of defense, right? Well, like, that is the logical conclusion, right? The logical conclusion is clearly automation, but it's like, it's only logical if I accept your premise that that's where I want to end up, right?
I get you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so I guess it's super interesting. It's super interesting, right? This idea of, and that's kind of what I got from the interview, was this idea of maximizing progress is at the detriment of sacrificing what you put on the other side of the spectrum, which was like humanity, right? We have to sacrifice everyone's in like what it means to be a human being in order to truly logically maximize whatever this thing is on the other side of the spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a lot of fun to write. And like, even as we're talking, I'm getting more and more like, there's stuff here that I'm like, yeah, it totally makes sense to the story. I didn't pick it up when I was writing it at all, but this is great.
To jump on that, I actually like, I think that's one of the craziest things about writing is, especially when you start to dissect it with other people or a community, or you see people dissecting your own work. At least I've had the experience of being like, they were able to pull things out of it that I didn't mean to put there, but like, great. That's super
awesome.
Cool too. Yeah. So I think that's one of the coolest things about like just writing in general, and like having your work out there for people to like play with, basically.
yeah, extrapolate their own ideas, and then they do a lot of the thought process for you quite often. Especially, it's just like amazing, the human mind. You give them like a place to play, and then the shit they can come up with by themselves is just incredible. And I mean, that was sort of the point of this sort of story. And I guess the point of like the void is to get these thought processes rolling in people's minds. Because it was, I think this story was the first time that I kind of broached the subject with my girlfriend, and she like put it down and she looked at me and she was like, that's fucking horrific. What the hell are you talking about? And I was like, explain the whole like automation thing. And she was like, nah, fuck that. I'm not getting into this. This is too much. But the more we talk about it now, the easier it is to accept, I suppose. And it'd be really, really good to see this sort of thing addressed, I suppose. Kind of has to be addressed eventually. In fact, I thought my previous industry was project management. And I thought by like slowly getting into like the creative arts, it was going to like help my future and secure something. And then I read this fucking article about some AI that now can write screenplays and books and shit better than most people can. And I'm like, Jesus Christ, nothing is safe. Absolutely nothing is safe. So yeah, it really, really sucks to a degree.
Yeah, it is. In this, and it is. It's terrifying, in a weird way, because it's not the way we thought, or at least I think anyone was thinking. Like AI was gonna like the danger of like artificial intelligence and of automation, like of these like computer programs, right? Like the danger is like Terminator, right? Like a humanoid
Yeah,
thing
that's
that's
the
way
idea.
smarter and faster than a person, but like that's not the thing that ended up. That's not the thing that's like seems to be on the horizon.
It's the obvious fear, but it's the actual underlying like far more mundane fear of automation that is actually the thing that we have to look out for. Which you're totally right. Yeah, especially for me growing up, the worst thing that could happen in my mind was for automation to create robots to start killing people. You know what I mean? Like, but it only occurred 6 7 years ago to me that this sort of thing would eventually kind of rock our entire like structure of society eventually. And I remember growing up seeing like comic books of like, like Archie and like, I don't know if you've ever seen the Archie comic books. It's some old ass shit, but yeah, just having like, metal robots, or like the Jetsons, like having a metal robot come up to you and like offer you a drink, and you assume that that's the
Yeah.
good automation. And that eventually we're all going to get to a point where we're like sitting on the beach, we're not working at all, and we've got like robots doing everything for us. But the truth is that like automation also in its possible like best case scenario, the way it's going right now, automation is not leading to everybody sitting back and doing nothing while robots do everything. The idea is to get people to do the base work to a point where they're no longer needed, and then just slowly push them either economically or literally push them out of life, I suppose.
Yeah, that is true, right? The right, we don't even get to the like your story reminded me a lot of a I don't know if you've ever read it, but of Brave New World by Aldous Huxley.
Yeah,
It was like an updated version of that, right? It was a modernized version of that with all these modern
yeah,
technologies, but they didn't even, right, but it pointed to this thing. And what you just said there was like, as we're getting closer and closer to the possibility of this like Huxleyan Brave New World, post scarcity, no need for work kind of world, we're not even doing the thing that we're supposed to do, which is like, okay, now that no one has to work, let's like provide everything for everybody. We're just like,
yeah.
as we progress and we need less and less people, we just like
Cut them away.
denigrate. Yeah, just like, well,
Yeah,
like figure it out, right? Like we just allow the underclass to grow and grow and grow and are like,
exactly.
yeah,
Yeah, and you'd assume that with an increased automation, you would see like 4-day work days or like 3-day work days, and still getting paid the same amount of money, but less emphasis on like the work required. But in no way do you see that. In fact, if you even mention it to most working class people, they almost scoff at the idea. Like, that's fucking ridiculous. How can you like reduce income and like reduce work hours and still get the same income? Like, especially the older generation, I found, not to be like too dismissive of the older generation, but there's this, especially in the industry that I was working in, there was this bias of like, I worked for 40 years for 40 to 60 hours a week. I would almost be upset if like the next generation only had to work 20 hours a week, which I always thought was a really strange stance to have on like, because isn't the point of like human growth or like our future is to make things easier and easier? Isn't it? It's like a success story if like the generation that comes next has an easier life than you. You would assume that that would be the entire point of of humans progressing, is to get to a point where we have the easiest life possible. We have the best medicine. We have food available all the time, and to be almost proud of the fact that we get to that point, rather than angry that like the generation that comes after us is afforded more sort of royalties or luxuries than we had. Because I'm seeing that a lot, especially in the project and construction industry. You see quite a bit of that. This anger at guys that are like, it used to take me like 2 days to do this sort of project, and now I can get it automated in 5 minutes. And this guy doesn't even need to learn basic maths because he has a computer to do everything for him, which is quite strange. And I think that permeates the entire thought process around the whole version of automation. Because if you try to suggest to people that automation should make your life easier, there's this weird like sense of like hostility towards that idea. Do you know what I mean? I don't know where it comes from, either it's like permeating through advertising or commentary or policies, but there's this idea that like people get hostile at the idea that like universal income. People that would benefit from universal income get very, very angry when you talk about universal income, because to them it's not fair for some reason, which doesn't make any sense, because we're producing more. Yeah.
Yeah, it's super. I don't think I've ever noticed this point, but I think you're dead on. Like it's such a strange reaction, right? It's like contrary to like if that's not the goal, right? If the goal in working like are say like if the goal of like the silent generation, right, the generation that fought World War II was not to like make it easier for the next generation, then like
Yeah.
what was the goal, right?
Yeah.
Like what are we like then what was the point, right? And it's so strange because the thing it seems to work on a small scale, right? Like the idea of the American dream, and that's something like, right, like I'm born into like that ethos, which is
Yeah.
like if I work hard, my children can have a better life, right? And my
Yeah.
parents worked hard so that I don't like so I can have a better life, right?
Yeah.
And like it's this like it's exactly what we talked, like exactly what seems to be like what we want on a societal level, which is like this trickle down through generations, and each generation gets, you have to sacrifice progressively less and less, and you would like don't have to work 70 hours a week, you only have to work 40, and then the next generation only has to work 30, and you have more time to like do the things you love and like all that, right? Like that's the idea of the American dream. But you're totally right, it's like as if that idea makes sense on a like familial level, but it's impossible for us to generalize it, right? Like, well, yeah, like if you're talking about my kid, I'd want my kid to work 30 hours a week because I work 60, but like everyone else's kids should work 60 because I work 60, and like that's fair.
Yeah. Exactly. You're totally right. It's this weird like individualistic thing where individually and as you said, like familiarly, you want your kids to do better. But yeah, there is a big fuck you to anybody that's outside of that little cone of your life, to anybody having a better or easier life. It's very strange, and it's very counterproductive. I don't know where the idea comes from. I'm still learning about it. I'm sure I'll eventually maybe get into it and figure it out, but there's definitely a host of things that are pushing people to kind of like individualize themselves and then get very angry at other people for having more or doing better or having an easier time of it, which is so fucking weird. I think that's a very human thing though at the same time.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
seems to be it seems to be like lizard brain instinct, right? It must be,
Yeah.
right? Because it generalizes basically to like every sphere, because it's not just about like I'm thinking about the future and like you're like, well, we can do this thing for like the next generation and they'll have easier. Like there's an aversion to that, but there's also an aversion to like if you see it currently, right? Like,
Yeah.
well, Bill Gates or whoever has $10 billion and like his life is super easy, and instead of being like right, like instead of being like even if you can like accept like, okay, maybe Jeff Bezos doesn't need $150 billion, right? Maybe that's a little too easy, but
Yeah,
like
he's
looking at anyone's success, right? Like your neighbor's a little bit more successful than you, and like they have a little bit of a nicer house and a little bit of a nicer life. Your immediate reaction isn't like, that's good, right? Like maybe I can get there. Maybe that's progress. Maybe we're getting closer to this, like less and less people have to work so hard. The immediate reaction is like, that's unfair, right? He's cheating in some way. They've gamed the system in some way. I'm oppressed or pushed in some way. It's just an immediate like aversion to anyone having it better than you almost.
yeah, totally right. And yeah, I think it, once again, like you're right on the we're hitting on like the individualism thing, because like you're right, like you look at, and I mean like I'm kind of biased because I look at Jeff Bezos and I'm like, fuck that guy, honestly. Sorry, like great success and well done for all that stuff, but like the praising somebody that gets to that level with his employees and warehouses earning below minimum wage. Anyway, we'll skip past that, but it's very much in those terms you look at like the individual and you're like, fuck that individual, rather than looking at the society and being like, oh, things are getting better for everybody, which is probably more so where everybody should be looking. And especially with like your upcoming election, um, the way that politicians seem to be speaking to people, it's not like when they say like, I haven't been looking a whole lot into it, but I know Trump is like giving Biden a ton of shit for trying to raise the tax level, even though I think it only applies to people earning over $400,000 or something like that.
Yeah, that is
Anyway,
exactly right.
yeah, he is. What he's doing is he's like pushing people to look at themselves individually and be like, your money, like you, Kelvin, your fucking money is going to get taxed and your kids are going to get affected, rather than looking at the entire whole and being like, this is to improve the entire country as a whole. Yeah, you so
Yeah, I just we are like inundated with the politics right now, right? Our election's in 2 weeks, so like
yeah,
everything, every moment of everything, if you turn on anything right now, it's like Trump versus Biden, the presidential election, blah blah
of
blah blah
course,
blah. But so like, but I like you're totally right that there's this like, right, the Republican push and right now like led by Trump and it's always this, right? In every election, it's always this like it's the tax question in the US at least is always the question of like, the Republican pitch is always they're trying to take your money, right? Like
yeah,
they're taking yours to like give it to someone who's like less deserving, right? Because they didn't earn it.
yeah,
And like that the problem I the problem I have with that is actually Democratic the Democrats' response to that, I think is like they haven't figured out the right way to pitch why you should be in favor of a higher tax rate if you make a lot of money, right? Because they pitch it as like it's a moral imperative and you're like kind of a terrible human if you don't like immediately agree with us that like you should be taxed at a higher rate. But I read in a short story by David Foster Wallace about this topic, and I thought like that was exactly right. Was what his basic premise was: the pitch is not about like you're better or worse if you want to give more or less of your money away. It's that like from an individual perspective, you should want a higher tax rate because it will make you feel better, literally. Like the idea that you're like, I'm giving money to people. It's just like, why do people give charity, right? Like you don't give charity. I'm sure like, okay, like maybe that's a kind of cynical, right? But like most people probably give charity because like it feels good to give charity, right? Like,
oh, you're
and so
right,
like,
yeah,
yeah, you pitched higher taxation. I think the pitch of higher taxation, if it comes in the form of like, it's like an altruistic good thing to do. And like when you wake up in the morning, you'll be like, yeah, you'll be able to like look outside and be like, yeah, I don't have my, right? Like Jeff Bezos is like, I don't have my third Lamborghini, but like there's less homeless people on the street. And like, I helped with that. And like, I get to feel good, like a sense of community and a sense of building. And I think neither of the parties in the US are able to hit on that instinct, right? The instinct, because we do have a human instinct for community and for helping others and that. And like, I don't think anyone's talking to that need right now. But I'm sorry, that's a huge rant about American
no, you're
politics.
right.
But
I love this shit. This is the stuff that I stay up late night with my friends talking about. But yeah, it's you're totally right in that. Should just completely lost my train of thought. Sorry, do you want?
totally good.
Yeah.
I was just saying, yeah, like this pitch to altruism
Oh
and
yeah,
like the need
of
for
course.
community and yeah, and how like
Yeah,
taxes play into all that.
sorry, mate. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that they, the Democrats might have very much like had a fucking meeting and being like, all right, guys, like let's pitch this like tax rate as like it's good for you, it'll make you feel better, it's good for the country, it's going to do all this stuff. And then I bet there was one guy in the meeting that was like in charge of like understanding like the social like aspects of America and was like, Americans don't give a fuck about that sort of thing in general. I bet that you'd have a better um, what they want to do is like individualize people again and like create a spectacle and be like, they probably are aiming to more towards like you if you pay a higher tax rate or you're a better person, which I reckon that probably hits closer to the masses, which is really sad because it shouldn't. It should be more about a you'll feel better and things will do, your country will be better. You are a part of a country, you're not just yourself, you are part of a country, a collective, and the collective will do better if your money over a certain amount is taxed higher. And I like, you see this a lot in like some European countries. Like I was in Switzerland for a while, and I'm not entirely sure what their tax rate is, but it's ridiculously high. But then again, a lot of your amenities are completely paid for you. So your um, childcare is paid for, completely free. Your schooling is basically paid for, and I think in some cases your university is paid for, which is a benefit of people paying a higher tax. But then when you try to individualize the issue, then it becomes like the Republicans are saying they're taking your money and then they're going to give it to somebody less deserving. Like they're going to give it to some fucker on the other side of the country that's being lazy, or they're going to spend it on universal income and let like the shitty younger generation like never work because they're, you know, as lazy as we promised you that they would be, which is just such a sad way of dealing with politics. It's the older I get, the more I just see this like punch for punch thing where it's like you guys are on this, you know, you're two wings on the same bird. You're supposed to be doing this shit together, but you're just fucking fighting
Exactly.
each other continually. I don't know. It's
Exactly. It's this constant I think, and I have a whole I'm way too focused on American politics, but I
they're the
have
best
a
politics.
I have a whole like my whole like theory of the case is that starting in like the post Reagan era and like the Clinton and Bush years, the politics turned right, like, and instead of offering a unifying, right, because it seemed as if they realized that the game theory dictates that like offering a unifying vision of the country is like might work, but like maybe not. In the most effective way is if you can divide off exactly 51% of voters and convince them that the other 49% of voters are like evil people that want to do like evil things and destroy like your country for the sake of like, it's just like, it's so silly, right? It's like you think the other 49% of the country that you live in, governed by the same laws, just wants to like burn it down for the sake of burning it down, right? And both sides believe that of each other, and it's way easier to convince people of that, right? Because you can always pitch that like every election is an existential threat, right? Right, if you hand Trump the keys to the castle, right, like him and his 49% of like evil white supremacists are going to burn America down. Or if you hand Obama the same keys, his 49% of the country is going to turn it into the USSR, right? Like,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
both of those are equally absurd, but like if you can truly convince people of that and terrify them of the other side, that's way more motivating than being like, kumbaya, right? Like we're all in this together and we have some disagreements, but like we'll figure it out, and like we're gonna change, like we're gonna tinker around the edges, and like, but we'll agree, right? Like that's just not the same. It doesn't have the same motivating like punch that it does for voters.
that's a really good point. I never really thought of it that way, but yeah, that totally hits the mark. It's not so much that they're running a campaign for the country; they're running a campaign for exactly 51%. It's all the fuck that they want. Yeah, I guess that's why minorities become so. You know, the people that are like on the fence, they become such a important factor
Of course,
of every election.
if you show that you're willing to switch, right? Like there's a very small contingent of people in the US that are willing to, like, there are a very small contingent of people that voted Obama and then voted Trump, right? Or voted for Bush and then voted for Obama. And those people are like 1 or 2% of the voting population, but they swing every election. So like they get whatever their demands are, whatever they want, they get like,
That's what they
that's
get
where
it.
you get actual substance, right? At least that's how I see American politics
Absolutely.
working.
Yeah, that's a very, very clear picture, actually. Totally makes sense. Never really thought of it quite that way. Um, but absolutely. So I suppose really those 3%, the people that are on the fence, those are the ones that kind of run the entire election to a certain degree. Um, cool. That was really interesting. A really,
um
really good chat.
yeah, that was great. Okay, so to we got, which is
I know,
totally
yeah,
fine, but we got
completely
way
off.
out here, which is totally cool. But to pivot back to the interview and to the void for October, I guess my question would be, we talked a little bit about like Aldous Huxley and Brave New World, and you talked a little bit about like your influences in writing the interview. I was just wondering, do you have like what do you think? Like I felt like echoes of like Black Mirror and like the dystopian like fiction tradition, right? Like 1984, Brave New World, these kind of things. Like, and I was wondering, do you feel like those things impacted you? What do you think like yeah, like what impacted your style and like, or your thoughts or anything? Like what was your impact? What impacted you?
Oh, totally. It was definitely Black Mirror was one of the biggest. A friend showed me that one day, and I just was hooked straight from the get go. It's such a perfect like parody. Um, it, very, very well done. Love the whole Black Mirror. Everything I write seems to be like very, very closely related to that sort of thing.
The interview was like, I was like, this could be a like script for a Black Mirror episode. That's what I thought. I was like, which is, I mean, in like the most complimentary terms. Like I think
Thank you.
Black Mirror is
Yeah,
amazing. Yeah.
yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
I don't mind if it sounds
Totally.
like it. Yeah. Yeah, and then obviously, of course, like Brave New World, 1984, Animal Farm. My mother is an English teacher, so she brought us up, pushing these sorts of like literature on us and making us think a lot, which was great now, but it really fucked me up when I was like 16, 17 with all this like random ass new ideas about the way that the world works. Because it's in essence, like all of these books and Black Mirror especially is a very pessimistic view on like humanity and like, you know, our condition, I suppose. So yeah, it was a bit. They're great, great. They're very, very good things to get into and very, very good things to talk about. But goddamn, did they make you depressed? And like, it really fucks you up when you're younger.
That's true, right? You can spin yourself, especially right, like if you're 16, 17, spin yourself into this like existential just despair of like,
Yep.
right, like human nature, right? In the need, like we have this like all the terrible things that seem to come just like hardwired onto our hard drive, right? Like the want to like there's like a instinct to like build these oppressive structures and to like, right, like no one reads 1984 and it's like, well, that could never happen, right? Like that's so far of field, like that makes just, everyone's like, oh yeah, like I totally like I feel the instinct to build something like that, even though I know how terrible it is. And that is, yeah, talk about depressing, right?
Yeah, you're right. You're right. I think that is exactly right. The most depressing part of it is how readily people accept that as kind of like, I can totally see the benefits of that exact kind of structure for society. You know, basically, what I haven't read the book in a long time, but reducing oxygen to a baby's brain to make them just stupid enough to be a laborer and nothing else.
Yeah,
Like
that's
that would
Brave New World. Yeah.
totally, sorry, Brave New World. That would totally um, that would solve all the problems here, to be honest, if we just had this nice little this nice little like structure of like socially accepting like pawns, I suppose. But yeah, that definitely big influence was these sorts of things. And it's really sad because like I used to really like reading fantasy books. That was my big thing, like The Wheel of Time and like Lord of the Rings and stuff. And they're great, but the older you get, the more pessimistic I got, I suppose, and then more interested I got in like the real horrors of the world, which is all inside your head and inside people's hearts, which is very depressing. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, it is depressing, but see if we can brighten up a little bit. I think there is like,
Sorry.
no, it's totally true, right? But I think the silver lining of those books and like these kind of books that truly explore like what what are the evil impulses that like lurk within all of us, right? And like why, and what are these things, and like what are the most horrible manifestations of like the worst humanity has to offer, and like make us think that like, well, maybe that's not so like absurd, right? Maybe that's not so far away. And this is a totally different thing, but like if you see what when I read 1984, right, and then you see what's happening in China. I don't know if you followed any of that, but the like the social scores and the constant surveillance, and they're like investing in like it like is as if they read 1984 as a manual for how to build like the perfect
For
totalitarian
exactly.
state. Yeah.
Yeah, you're
And it's
totally right. I
just,
saw that, and terrifying. I mean, they have a similar episode on Black Mirror. I don't know which one it was, but it was one where your score on your app dictated your ability to buy a house, etc. And they have the exact same scoring system there. They have like a you have a score, and it would increase or decrease based on things like voluntary work or like you pay your taxes on time, etc. And if you have low enough of a score, apparently you can't get a passport. And I was watching like an interview of a woman who um, this woman was one of the leftovers from the one child policy, right? So she was a girl born into a family that already had a daughter, but instead of like getting rid of her, they kind of kept her in secret. But then that means she has no official documents. She has no like she doesn't exist in a record. And now that they've switched over to this like bizarre fucking social structure thing, this application, she can't even buy a house because she doesn't exist anymore. Which it's just people like it's that humanitarianism falling through the cracks. That's so terrifying. And yeah, you're right. These books, in a large degree, are written by authors to kind of be like, please don't do this in the future. See the potential horrors that we could face, and like recognize the initial beginnings and then shut them down quickly. And it would be a really, really good message to think that like, hopefully people read these sorts of things and then recognize them and then actively try to stop them. Seems like nobody in China read any of those books, which kind of sucks.
well, that's right. That right. That's the what you just pointed to was like that's the power of literature, right? That's why you read. That's why it's important. That's
Yeah,
why it's important that we write, and it's important that we read, and it's important that we like, think about this stuff and discuss it, right? But what is the first thing you do if you come to power in a totalitarian regime? Is like you censor everything, right? Because of that exact reason, right?
of course. Yeah,
You don't get like there's no I can't walk down to like the local Barnes and Noble in Beijing and like pick up a copy of Orwell and be like, oh, this is exactly what I'm living through. Maybe this
yeah,
isn't such a good idea, right? Because they know
yeah.
like, and I think even how horrible that is, but I think that again is I tried to get this silver lining, and it's real small, but right, it is that like the fear of that from totalitarians, right, and totalitarian states is proof of the fact that there is this like for every like piece of evil in the human soul, there is like an equivalent piece of like good, right? That like
Good.
you can access, and like totalitarian states do fall and people rebel, and like in like authoritarians are in constant fear of these ideas getting within their borders because they'll erode the whole system from the inside out, because the like people have this like people have the ability to change and to find like the good, I guess. And that would be my morning pitch for like humans, you know.
That's great, Max. That's like the most positive thing I've heard in a couple of weeks. Yeah, you're definitely a very positive person, which is great. I think I used to be that person, and then he just disappeared along the way. But yeah, you're totally right. Totalitarian. That's the first thing they do is censorship, and that's like a whole nother discussion, censorship. But like also in the interview, I don't know if it made it to the final cut because I didn't. There's like 6 different versions of the interview, but um, the idea of like totalitarian winning, because as you say, they do eventually get toppled, etc. And in the interview, it was suggested that the old power structures that were pulled down were the ones that were too obvious. They were doing things that were too obvious.
You
The
pull
ones that
down.
really worked out, yeah, the ones
Yeah,
that
you,
really
you,
worked
you
out
pull
were
down.
the
Sorry, you pull down 1984 and replace it with Brave New World, right? Like the actual power structure that works is not the one that's like obvious about its like
yeah,
crackdown. It's the
yeah,
one that displays itself as a utopia it's secretly a dystopia.
But it's secretly a dystopia. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. And like you're seeing that more and more, I suppose, in the general world, which is a whole nother conversation. I know that we've like finished our hour.
Yeah, if you have to
Yeah.
go, that's totally fine.
Yeah, no, it's not so much that I have to go. It's just that about this time my internet connection starts to
Okay,
basically
great.
clean out.
So
Yeah.
let's wrap it up. This has been amazing. Like this has been a
Oh,
fantastic interview.
thanks, Mike.
I feel like I like learned so much, and I think our listeners and readers will also appreciate that. But I will let you go. But I have to ask one question that I call like
Yeah.
the ultimate cliche of questions to end the
All right.
interview, and it is if you were talking to like someone who loves to read, what would you give them as like 3, 5-ish, there's no like set number of books that you think you must read? What's on your like must read list?
Oh, geez. Yeah, that's a big question for me. Must read. It depends what age, but I guess. Um, so my girlfriend and I have nieces and nephews that are young, and we're trying to get them to slowly push into reading. But the first thing that I would absolutely push on like their age group, because we've been talking about this a lot, was Animal Farm. It was like the very first book that I ever read, and it's only like 80 pages long. It's a very straightforward read. That makes a lot of sense. That can really show you the very logical progression from like good things to bad things. Other than that, I have such a generic list, um, which is kind of shocking actually. My can't really think of him. You really have put me on the spot there, Max.
It is
Sorry.
it's
Yeah.
like it's a real it sounds like an easy question, but it's really like really does put you on the spot, right? Like when
Yeah.
you start thinking, like, well, there are just so many books, right? How do I possibly choose, right? Like 3 that like you must read. Um, Animal Farm is perfect. I think that's a great one. And
It's a starter book for me. It's the one that
yeah,
first got me thinking about things. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Another huge thing, like I suppose one of the things that I kind of live by is this is going to be very far left field. It's going to be The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan, which is a fantasy novel, which I've been reading since I was like 16. And I know it doesn't really have a lot to do with like politics, etc. And it's not even based in this world. It's a completely different world. But it was the most like structured way of like viewing the way that a society would react to certain events um, in a very sort of honest manner, right? So we have a main character who is basically fixing things in this broken world and doing tremendous things. And as a reader, you read this stuff and you're like, holy shit, everyone's going to be like so fucking like pumped that this guy has like cured this disease, etc. But the very first thing that happens when he cures the disease is that everybody goes, oh, did you really cure the disease? Have you actually done some sneaky thing where you're now this a bigger disease? Fuck you, man. Like, what the hell are you doing? And he gets just destroyed for this sort of thing. And that really changed my view on things. I think I was about 18 when I read that. And I realized that you can be completely honest and completely truthful and be doing the best thing that you possibly can for humanity. And somebody can still take those intentions and turn them into some evil fucking thing. And it's actually that the first story in this October's edition, which I think was written by I forgot who it was. Diogenes.
Oh yeah, Diogenes. That's a pen name, but
Diogenes.
yeah, yeah.
Oh, it's that. Okay, yeah. Sorry. When he talked about how everything was basically perspective based, and that you can basically, you can do the best thing in the world for somebody, and they can still take the worst thing out of it, and that's just people's brains. Yeah, it's Robert Jordan, Real Time, good book.
Awesome.
Books.
Thank you so much, KJ. I'm certain we will have you on again. But as for now, have a great day, and thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Max. Cheers. Thanks very much.